Hey guys, today the new inflation reading came out for the month of August, and we saw an unexpected rise at 8.3%. So today we're going to talk about the ever rising risk of a debt spiral and how the US is depleting their oil reserves to artificially decrease inflation in the short term. So we saw inflation at 8.3% year over year, which was higher than expectations, even with the significant drop in energy prices. Now, as this article from Bloomberg states, the US is depleting its strategic petroleum reserve faster than it looks. Now, as we can see here on this graph, we had oil reserves of 284 million barrels in 1982 when we first started this initiative. And then we've maintained above 500, 600 throughout the past 4 decades. But now we're seeing a sharp decline because the US is releasing these barrels onto the free market and then artificially decreasing the price of oil in the short term. Now, that may sound great. You may think, oh, the US is using some of their resources to help families. Now, while some of that may be true, that is curbing the whole idea of a free market. Now, in a free market where demand and supply are relatively close to equilibrium, when one of them goes out of whack, and in this case, the supply drastically decreased because of the Russian and Ukraine war, then the demand has to meet it. So, with less supply, the price rises. Now, when the price rises, that incentivizes companies who produce this energy to then increase their production to make more money. Now, when you artificially stimulate the price lower, then it takes away that incentive for the companies to increase production to then make supply and demand equal. So, once they get lower and lower and eventually trend towards zero of their strategic petroleum reserve, the prices will then rise again, and the exact same problem will still be apparent, except for now we took away all of that amount of time for them to increase production because the US government is not allowing them to produce more. Now, as we've seen inflation fall from its previous highs of above 9%, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw upwards of 9% again. With services now on the rise again, once oil continues to rise in price after the US stops stimulating it artificially, we could see higher and higher inflation, or at least persistent inflation, throughout the next couple of years. Now, it sounds all doom and gloom, and yes, it is kind of negative, but it's the reality of the situation we're living in and the lies that we're being told. The Inflation Reduction Act does nothing to reduce inflation in reality. It actually stimulates the economy and puts more money into the system. And as we should know at this point, after 2020 with the massive stimulus, more money in the system drives inflation. Now, moving on to the effect that inflation has on the stock market, we can see that it was a massive red storm today. We had Microsoft down 4%, Apple down 5.36%, Google down 5%, Amazon down 6%, Tesla down 3%, Visa and MasterCard down 2 or 3. We can see that all sectors were hit very hard today, and there was no place to hide except for a few basic materials companies. And this will continue as long as inflation stays as high as it is. The red will keep on coming, and the inflation pressures will reach the lower and middle class first. Now, to give this discussion about inflation a little more perspective, I thought that this visual was a good representation of what the government's financials really look like. And as we can see, on the left is the revenues of the government, and on the right is the expenditures in 2021. As we can see, individual income accounted for $2 trillion of the revenue. 1.2 trillion was Social Security and Medicare taxes, 372 billion was corporate income taxes, and then we get smaller and smaller amount all the way to equal this green line right here. Now, expenditures. What is the government spending, and how does that compare to what they're bringing in? So, as we know, a company needs to make money and generate profit in order to continue. They can't continuously accrue debt and never pay it back. Now, the government doesn't have the same problem. The government's income security accounts for 1.6 trillion, Social Security accounts for 1.1 trillion, health 700 billion, national defense 700 billion, Medicare 700 billion, net interest 300 billion, commerce and housing credit 300 billion, and the list goes on and on. And as we can see, the government does not generate anywhere near the amount needed to pay for their expenses. They have a deficit of $2.77 trillion. $2.7 trillion is what the government is looking to accumulate in revenue so then they can pay for their expenses. Now, to solve for a deficit, the US has 3 ways out. You can cut entitlements, which they won't do because that would be extremely unpopular and they would be voted out. They could tax the populace more. Now, that's also something that they won't do because it is very unpopular, or they could borrow more money. And we've seen in 2020 and 2018, that is what they did. They decided to borrow more money and increase their deficit even more. Now, this net interest expense is very interesting because this net interest, as they borrow more money, will increase. So, in order to solve for the deficit, they are increasing their expenditures at the same time. And over time, this will compound over and over again as they need to pay more and more interest to the Federal Reserve, who is buying their debt with money that they created out of nowhere. Now, I know this may be a lot to someone who's never heard of these concepts before, but try and hang with me. So, they are most likely going to prefer to print money out of this situation. So, how does that affect us? Well, we saw what happened in 2020, where more money in the system creates a larger dollar amount, chasing the same amount of goods and services, creating higher prices. So, them borrowing more money and stimulating the economy more will create higher inflation, and therefore create more of the problem that they are trying to solve for. And it's also important to realize and emphasize again that when the government borrows money from the Federal Reserve, meaning that when the Federal Reserve buys the government's bonds, the government has to pay interest on the bonds of which the Federal Reserve just purchased. And as the government increases interest rates in order to curb inflation, they have to pay a higher dollar amount on those bonds as interest rates rise, therefore then increasing their expenditures even farther. Now, the only way to realistically or feasibly pull this off is to do something similar to what they did post-World War II. They had an excessive amount of debt, and they had to figure out what to do with it. And they decided to borrow excessively and peg the treasury yield at low rates. So when you peg the treasury yields at low rates, then the government has to pay less interest to the person who then borrows from them. But they also decided to inject money into the economy, therefore increasing inflation. So if I'm borrowing at a 2% rate and inflation is at a 4% rate, I'm making 2% on my money year over year, and my debt is in real terms decreasing. But when they do this at the expense of the taxpayer and the lower and middle class. Now, you may be thinking, doesn't sound fair, it doesn't sound real, and I wasn't taught about this in school. Well, you'd be right about all of those. And when they did this in World War II, gold was illegal. There was no way out. There was no safe place to store your money. You couldn't opt out and use gold, and Bitcoin didn't exist. But now, gold is legal, and an even more sound money exists, being Bitcoin. Many other countries' currencies are getting destroyed by this same practice. Now, the US dollar is not going anywhere. And in fact, the US dollar will remain far more dominant than any other currency, and other currencies will fall. Because, as Greg Foss would say, the US dollar is the best house on the crack street. Now, what do you do to escape this? The only way is to opt out of the fiat system. Opt out, choose Bitcoin, or have your money stolen by the federal government to cover their own mistakes. Now that's it, guys. Have a good day.